It's called Climate Change, Risk, and the World Response. And this will be a discussion with Professors David Deese and Jeremy Shakin. It will happen Wednesday, December 2nd at 7 p.m. in Fulton 415. For tonight, our talk is, what are my hopes for COP21 and beyond? A senior faculty conversation about global climate change. And our discussion will be moderated by Professor Tiziana Deering of the Graduate School of Social Work. So thank you, Tiziana.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? I've got the fancy clip mic. Great. I hopefully have the fairly meaningless responsibility of moderating this discussion because hopefully it will take off quite well on its own. But the title for today is My Hopes for COP21 and Beyond. And just to put context, COP21 is the 21st Conference of the Parties for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. As the New York Times put it in an article today, President Obama and more than 100 world leaders will convene with thousands of diplomats on the outskirts of Paris to open 2 weeks of intense negotiations aimed at forging an accord that could begin to avert the most devastating effects of global warming and redefine the economy of the 21st century. In the shadows or under the umbrella or with the auspices, however you want to put it, of COP21, it created for us an opportunity to invite a reflective interdisciplinary discussion among faculty here at BC regarding both climate change and how we can address it in our research and our teaching across disciplines. Not everybody who engages with the question of climate change or the ambitions of COP21 needs to be an expert in that field. The question is, how do experts in a variety of fields begin to engage in this large, important, and systemic issue? And that's really our focus for today. Just to kind of close that, as the invitation for today's event noted, environmental sustainability is a quintessentially interdisciplinary issue. I knew I was not going to be able to say quintessentially interdisciplinary right the first time. Too often, however, academic conversations rely exclusively on scientific experts and isolate climate change from other disciplines. On the opening day of COP21, this conversation will provide an opportunity for faculty to reflect on their hopes for the negotiations and consider how attention to climate change can be practically integrated into teaching, research, and service across BC and across society. So I'd like to introduce our faculty. They have no responsibility for the bios. I pulled these from public web pages, so if anything's wrong, it is entirely the fault of me and the internet. And I'm just going to go down the list as I wrote them. But then when we go, I think we're going to go in this order just because that works. And I wanted Jeremy to go last anyway, and we managed to get him seated on the end, so this should work just fine. Professor Tom Childs is the DeLuca Chair in Biology. Tom is the second one here. He's our Vice Provost for Research and Academic Planning. He is also spearheading a new initiative at the University on Integrated Sciences. Dr. Childs' laboratory interrogates cellular physiology and function in B lymphocytes, specifically the function and regulation of glucose and glutamine metabolism in B lymphocyte growth and survival. And yeah, I practiced saying that one a few times too. Professor Catherine Corneal, if you could, thanks, is the Newton College Alumni Chair in Theology at the School of Theology and Ministry. Her research interests, sorry? No?
In the Department of Theology.
In the Department, thank you, of Theology and Ministry. These are the kinds of mistakes that my dean cringes at when I make them all the time, so I apologize for that. Her research, but you can blame it on me, not my dean. Her research interests focus on theology of religions, the theory of interreligious dialogue, and the phenomenon of enculturation and incultural theology, to name a few. Is there anything else you'd like to add to that? Okay. Professor Mary Crane, Mary is next to Catherine, and let's hope I get this one right, is the Thomas Radigan Chair in English. She specializes in English Renaissance literature and cultural, especially intellectual history, history of science and technology, and cognitive literary theory. Professor Crane also directs BC's Institute for the Liberal Arts, which is dedicated to fostering innovative programs in the liberal arts that will enhance the intellectual lives of students and faculty. Professor Joe Quinn, to my left, is in the Department of Economics here. He recently served as interim provost for the university. His current research interests include labor economics, economics of aging, and social security reform. We are participating together in an inequality seminar, and I am learning a great deal from Joe on that subject as well. And it's been a lot of fun to hear his thinking. Professor Judy Vesey. Professor Vesey is the inaugural Lila Holden Carroll Chair in Nursing. She is a developmental pediatric nurse practitioner and a leading nurse researcher in the field of pediatric nursing. She emphasizes issues faced by children with chronic conditions and their families. So Professor Jeremy Shaken, right? Shaken, not stirred? Shaken.
Shaken, not stirred.
Okay. Shaken, not stirred. And Jeremy, like me, doesn't hold an endowed chair of anything, so we're on the two ends. But he is a wonderful and respected scholar on climate science and an assistant professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences. While we wanted to explore this topic from a number of perspectives, having our resident expert participate was also quite important to us, and so we'll have him make his comments last. Did I do justice to the bios in my shortened way? Good, I'm glad. So we asked each professor to think about, wrestle with, and or reflect openly about how you're thinking about climate change in your own work, how it affects your discipline or how your discipline might engage with the issue, and how your discipline can engage with global climate change in the classroom. Each panelist is going to speak for 5 minutes, and then I'll moderate a discussion between the panelists, and then we'll open it up to questions and answer and discussion with the audience. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it to Joe, who will go first.
I get to start, and I like to stand up. So welcome to Amateur Hour. Be warned, this is not my area of expertise. I explained this to Jim Keenan, but he made me do this anyway. Economists tend to evaluate policy proposals by estimating and comparing the costs and benefits of doing something. If the benefits outweigh the costs, that's an argument for doing it. Even though almost any policy change will have winners and losers, some folks are inevitably going to be worse off, and actually they're often the poor. All we ask is that the gains of those better off, the winners, exceed the losses of those who are worse off, the losers. Which means that theoretically, although rarely in practice, one could compensate all the losers for their losses with the gains of the winners and still be net, as a society, better off. Occasionally, we can actually think of ways to compensate the losers, but mostly not. If we required that the losers be compensated, we'd almost never do anything because there are always people worse off. Note that finding that the benefits exceed the costs is not the end of the argument, it's the beginning of the argument, and a reason to think further about doing this. There still may be political, ethical, legal, moral reasons not to do what's being proposed, even if the benefits exceed the losses. Now, I think several things differentiate the discussion of global warming from more typical cost-benefit discussions that we do all the time. And they make this issue much, much more harder than what we usually deal with. Let's put it in terms of sort of bending the curve of global temperature rise. Doing things so that the temperature rises on Earth less than they would have if we didn't do these things. These would mostly be policies that resulted in less environmental damage than we otherwise would do. Well, how might we do this? Well, perhaps using less fuel altogether, more fuel-efficient cars and planes, biking or carpooling to work, lowering the temperatures in your house or in the dorm during the winter. Or we might use a different mix of fuels than we now do. Less coal, for example, which most people seem to think is the worst polluter. More wind and solar-generated energy. More or less natural gas, I'm not sure. It's carbon-based, which is bad, but it's a good one among the carbon-based, which is good. I suspect we will need natural gas for quite a while. And I would hope, but others might not, lots more nuclear energy, which may be the most practical answer of all, especially if we recycle the spent fuel like the French do. And finally, leaving behind less carbon dioxide when carbon fuels are burned using technologies that trap pollutants before they get into the atmosphere. So what's so hard about this particular issue? And I will end with 4 points. 1, we're moving into uncharted territories, higher world temperatures than we have ever experienced before. We can't refer to past experiences to gauge what these temperatures will do. What are the costs? What are the benefits of higher temperatures? Rising seas, harsher storms, coral destroyed. These sound all bad to me. On the other hand, perhaps there'll be more arable land as crops are grown further north and further south from the equator. Imagine New England grapefruit or wheat from the Yukon Territory. And as an example of uncharted territory, there's a common wisdom that a 2 degrees Celsius increase brings us to the edge of disaster. But today's Wall Street Journal claims that's an arbitrary threshold based on tenuous research emerging more from a political agenda, we need a goal, than from a scientific one. I think we really don't know what another 2 or 4 additional degrees would do. And I suspect that these increases are non-linear. In other words, knowing what happens as we go from 0 to 1 degree more may not tell you much about what happens when we go from 3 to 4. Secondly, not only are we moving into uncharted territory, but the importance of these issues are unprecedented. Rising sea levels could displace millions of people from Bangladesh and Miami and parts of New York, perhaps underwater, not the heights at BC, thank goodness. Al Gore claims that if Greenland melted, the world's oceans would rise by 20 feet. Others say 3 feet is more plausible over the next century. The point is, we don't know. Ice is already melting faster than predicted only a decade ago. We are groping in the dusk, if not in the dark, on something of monumental importance. Which brings me back to my third point. We not only need the best estimates of what might happen, but we have to think about the implications of being wrong in our estimates in both dimensions. What if it turns out that 1 or 2 degrees increase Celsius is not as catastrophic as we predicted? That's certainly good news, but then we've done some costly things in the interim that might not have been worth it, might not have been necessary in retrospect. On the other hand, what if what happens as the temperature rises is worse than we anticipated, and catastrophe might ensue? We must consider that as well, both sides of our best prediction. And I must say I worry a lot more about the latter, what happens being worse than we predicted, than the former. And my last point, many, if not most problems in the world, according to economists, stem from something being mispriced. Here the mispriced, the underpriced item is carbon, the price of which should reflect both the cost of extracting it and delivering it to your gas station or your house, which the cost does represent, but it also should represent the cost of the environmental damage that your consumption and other people's consumption is creating. The appropriate carbon tax would take care of this. It would provide an incentive for me to drive less, turn the heat down, because my fuels would be more expensive, my carbon-based fuels would be more expensive. It gives all carbon polluters, like electricity generators, an incentive to either use less fuel, use cleaner fuel, or introduce technology that keeps the carbon out of the atmosphere. And it makes non-carbon-based energies, our beloved wind and solar, and my beloved nuclear energy, relatively less expensive and therefore more attractive at the margin. If the problem is too much carbon, make it more expensive. One objection to this might be that this would be tough on the poor because the prices of their fuel would go up, which is undoubtedly true. Anything that makes anything more expensive is tough on the poor. But the poor, especially worldwide, are also the most vulnerable to these issues if we don't do something about it. Bottom line, without a lot of specific knowledge on this issue, I am very worried by what little I know. We may be on the edge of an irreversible worldwide disaster, though I don't believe anyone who tells me that he or she knows exactly what this disaster will entail. I would rather err on the side of doing too much now and backing off later than doing too little now and being unable to compensate for that error later. A simple solution, the simplest solution, and one in which I have great confidence, is to raise the price of all carbon-based fuels to a level that approximates the damage they are doing, and make it in people's own self-interest to use less, which they will certainly do. Done.
Thank you very much. So we have a hand-down mic if you want to use that, or if you'd like to come up to the podium and speak, whatever's more comfortable for you.
I'm gonna wing it.
All right. And he's up.
Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Stand behind them. So I want to thank Jim for allowing me the opportunity to be here this afternoon and talk to you about this important topic. And very wonderful and highly accurate introduction, I might add.
Thank you.
So I was asked to talk to you today about several things, and what I thought I would do is tell you my own kind of personal perspective on two aspects of climate change. The first as it pertains to my research and my professional activities both at BC and on several commissions that I serve on. And then I thought I would talk to you about how climate change, the way at least I'm thinking about it, impacts what I do here at BC in the classroom, and importantly, how it's going to affect the way in which I believe Boston College will train future leaders to help impact the world and solve some of these very complex problems. So, as Tatiana mentioned, my research primarily focuses on infectious diseases. I work with both material scientists and infectious disease specialists to not only study how the immune system responds to infectious disease insults, but also we're working to design handheld mobile phone portable devices that can detect infectious diseases in low and medium income countries around the world. And so what I can tell you is that we already have overwhelming evidence that climate change in the form of temperature increases can significantly impact the spread of infectious diseases. One only needs to look at some of the waterborne vector diseases such as malaria and dengue fever. Those diseases are spreading. If you look at East Africa, for example, they're moving now into the highlands of East Africa, and that is a direct consequence of increased temperatures on the planet. If you look in our own country alone, we're now seeing malaria in the southern states and in Texas, the likes of which we haven't seen before. These are all attributed to the increase in temperature, but also the change in environmental humidity and things that impact speciation and deforestation. We see these types of diseases spreading. And so for someone who studies the spread of infectious diseases and the impacts of these diseases on human health, this is an area that is of great concern. In fact, if you look at the recent World Health Organization report that is assessing the global burden on health of climate change, the data that they present now for 2030 is that there will be a significant increase in infectious disease transmission and incidence around the globe. Something I want to touch on in a moment is that at a place like BC, a university that at its foundation is a Jesuit Catholic university, I think when we do discuss climate change, we need to think of it in the context of our tradition. And climate change, and more so pollution, if you will, is really an environmental justice issue. And climate change, as well as pollution, is going to disproportionately impact the poor. It's going to impact low-income countries and medium-income countries, those populations that are the most vulnerable. And it's going to impact their economies, it's going to impact their health, it's going to impact a variety of things. We need to be cognizant of that, and as a Jesuit Catholic University, I believe we need to take a role in not only being cognizant of those impacts, but also being a leader in helping solve those types of problems. And that really segues into the last thing I would like to talk about, and that is our responsibility as a university. So I think one way, and you know, there are many ways, but I think one way in which Boston College can impact climate change in a meaningful way is in how we train our students. And in fact, in the research that we do here at this university. We now live in a world unlike a world we lived in before. The problems are complex in nature. They are not going to be solved by one branch of science alone. They're not going to be solved by science alone. One, and you've heard me say this before, one need only look at the outbreak of Ebola in West Africa. Before December 2014, when there was an outbreak of Ebola in Africa, it usually burned itself out in about 14 to 21 days. We still have Ebola being rampant in certain parts of Africa today. That epidemic has been going on since December 2014. Despite the fact that we threw engineering and science and medicine at it from day one, we were not able to solve that problem. In other words, to get a handle on that epidemic. And the reason why, in part, is because it was a problem that was complex in nature, that was not just biology and epidemiology and infectious disease. It was a country that was ripped with civil war. It is an area of the planet that is some of the most impoverished areas in the world. It had no healthcare infrastructure. It didn't have, many parts of the countries that were impacted didn't even have any roads. So all the science that we had really couldn't get a handle on this because we didn't consider all of these other issues, particularly the cultural issues, the economic issues, the societal issues, and things like that. So when I mention complex problems and how Boston College can contribute to that, I'm framing that in the context of some of the ideas that we're proposing. This notion, as many of you have heard, we're proposing an Institute for Integrated Science and Society. And at the heart of that is that we want to not only train our faculty, but recruit faculty, but train our students to think outside of their own discipline and outside of their siloed discipline, to train them in the art of collaboration, to train them how to go about approaching a complex problem such as climate change, such as pollution, for example. We also want to train our students to act and think in a just manner. And being at a Jesuit Catholic university, I think that's how we are going to align the mission of this institute with our values. So moving forward, I think the university has a responsibility to train, and you've heard this many times before, the future science leaders and policy leaders, et cetera, that are going to impact this planet. And I think our role should be, we should do this by giving them all the tools they need, train them in the art of collaboration to solve these problems. So I will leave it at that and then take questions later.
Thanks very much.
Have a trend going on here. Thank you so much, and thank you for the lovely introduction, and which was all correct, but there was one little error of omission which will be important to my comments today, and I'm fortunate enough to also still practice at both Boston Children's Hospital and the VA Medical Center. So when I addressed my comments tonight, we were asked to think about talking about this from the perspective of our own work. And this most certainly doesn't fit into my research per se, but it does from a clinical advantage. So when I think about this, I really think about this from the perspective of whom I care for. And this really is an unprecedented phenomenon, and it threatens human health on a number of different levels. What is important to remember, though, is populations with adverse health increase, they further stress healthcare, the healthcare system, and healthcare delivery. We tend to only look at this from one side, and as my colleague Tom really talked about, how the increases in vector-borne diseases are a direct result of some of what we're seeing in climate change. He mentioned dengue fever. I will also say we have seen alerts at one hospital or the other on dengue fever, chikungunya, and plague, none of which are things that I would have thought that would be immediately in the Boston area. They're not in the Boston area, but they are in the VA Medical Center and other parts of this country. And we are seeing more notifications on how to detect this and what to do with this should this cross our paths. The global list, of course, is much more extensive. But there are also some other health effects that are either directly or indirectly related to climate change. The first is just the increase in temperature exacerbates all heat-related illnesses and the morbidity and mortality from a lot of chronic conditions in large swaths of our population, particularly in the Western world. Extreme weather events are associated with crop failures and subsequently result in hunger, famine, and poor health. The long-term piece of that is we know from studies of individuals who were starved during or women who were starved during pregnancy, their children are much more likely to have intellectual impairment, have early onset diabetes, and a number of other conditions. So there's some things coming out that are not immediately associated with this. We also know that extreme weather events displace large sections of the population, either temporarily or permanently. The results from that, we think about the short-term impacts in terms of injury and illness, but the long-term impacts are much more significant. And studies that have followed folks who had to evacuate from New Orleans during Katrina have shown long-term physical and mental health problems that will no doubt persist throughout the entire life. As both of my colleagues mentioned, it is the certain populations are way more vulnerable. We've talked about the poor. I want to add to that the young, the old, and the disabled. So it's not, poverty in itself is one huge factor. It is not the only one. Now, I want to flip the dialogue because we tend to talk about what climate change does in terms to making health worse. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of what we do in healthcare that is contributing to climate change. The health consequences of climate change further add to the problem as unhealthy individuals use a disproportionate amount of healthcare resources. What is interesting, however, is the larger healthcare industry is not an unwitting bystander in all this. They account for approximately 18% of the GDP in this country, about 8% of emissions, and a significant amount of garbage that's sent to landfills. And it's my opinion that a major healthcare contributor to the production of all the greenhouse gases and other waste is secondary to patient safety initiatives, which creates an interesting dilemma. Because all the patient safety pieces generate significant amounts of medical waste. That said, I did a quick Google search and retrieved no meaningful information because there's nothing out there on the relationship between patient safety, medical waste, and climate change. So, as a nurse, one of the things we do is we're very much centered on individuals, families, and communities, and our professional organizations have tried to get their arms around this, but really haven't moved forward in very much of a concerted effort, either the American Nurse Association or the International Council of Nurses. And we just really are not much of a player at the international table. But if you were to ask me what we need, and this echoes my colleagues, we need both disciplinary specific and interdisciplinary empirical and qualitative research to explore the impact of climate mechanisms on health. And the areas where I particularly see great lapses are in measurement, adaptive measures across the developmental spectrum, and interventions designed to improve the health at the individual, family, community, and environmental levels. In the absence of hard science, but in the very real presence of climate change, we need to help prepare clinicians now about how to address some of the issues that can make a difference right now in everyday clinical practice. So I think I may stop there. Our last question was, how can your discipline engage with global climate change in the classroom? I have a number of ideas that are specifically discipline specific. I do want to say, if BC moving towards way more interdisciplinary courses, particularly at the core level, I think is critically important to move forward this agenda. But I also think we have a responsibility to, why we educate students globally, is to help teach our students to act locally. And with that, I'd like to just stop with, well, really two thoughts. But the one I'd like to leave you with is where I'd like to see BC act immediately is to ban smoking on this campus. We are the only campus in the Boston area of any decent size that still does not have a total campus ban on smoking. So we really want to start right there. 1 in 5 deaths in the US today in some way are attributed to tobacco use. So if we want to start locally, I would suggest that's where we start. And I'm going to end with a quote from Sister Carol Keenan. She's the CEO of the Catholic Health Association and a registered nurse. And she sums it up by saying, we actually have a responsibility to not only cure things we can cure, but if you can prevent someone from ever getting a sickness and you don't do it, you know what? That's pretty much inexcusable. And I think that's where we are.
Thank you. Stay with your break to turn.
I'll go, I can hide. No one will be able to see me. If I go behind us.
We can still see.
So this may be less than 5 minutes. There are lots of literature professors, especially people who study the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, who work on environmental issues and climate change pretty directly. Unfortunately, as I explained to Jim, I work on the 16th century. And the 16th century is not just pre-fossil fuels and pre-climate change, it's also pre-industrial revolution and pre-scientific revolution. So what I study and teach is actually quite a different world, literally. My research does focus on, and I just wrote a book about, attitudes toward nature in the 16th century, right before the scientific revolution, and how people felt about the beginnings of the sort of change in attitude that led people to be determined to sort of control nature. And so I think there might be some utility to helping people understand the prehistory of how we got to where we are in terms of how we think about nature. So, you know, my research focuses on, and when I teach, I talk about the fact that in England especially, the sort of view of the universe that was inherited from classical antiquity in the Middle Ages was based on an idea that actually your ordinary experience of nature necessarily gave you access to the truth about it, and anything that you couldn't sense or experience sort of couldn't be important or couldn't be true. And there was also a belief that God controlled nature. In the 16th century, all of a sudden, people started to notice and discover things that revealed to them that your ordinary experience of nature is tricking you. So, for instance, it appears as if you look up into the sky, the sun is moving around the earth. And that's not true. And it really freaked people out to sort of realize, wait a minute, our relationship to nature, we thought we were part of it. We thought we were in touch with it. Actually, it's lying to us in some sort of way. And empiricism really involved a step of realizing that you had to sort of study nature in a focused way and kind of make it do unnatural things in order to understand how it worked and then take control of it. In England, this was especially intense because Protestants sort of tried to made the argument that God didn't meddle in nature anymore. So people sort of one kind of solace in living lives where they had no control over disease, no ability, agriculture was totally at the mercy of weather, no heat, no plumbing, that you could believe that God, you could pray, God would at least not destroy the world immediately. There's this, a belief that you had some sort of control. And that went away too. And it really got people, especially in England in the early 17th century, thinking, we've got to do something about this. And Francis Bacon wrote really kind of influential treatises that talked about taking nature and dragging her in chains and forcing her to give up her secrets and, kind of helping human beings at the expense of nature. So there's a long way from that to climate change. In my service role at BC, I do support financially some of the interdisciplinary kinds of projects that Tom was talking about. So even our Common Home project. And I also think it's important for the new core courses to include courses that focus on the environment, and they do. So there are people doing things more directly than I can do given my research. So,
Thank you.
So, good evening. My field, as was said, is theology. I'm currently chairing the theology department, but my own particular field of research is interreligious dialogue and comparative theology. The focus on climate change is not one that is one of my emphases, but we do have many people in the department, and what's particularly encouraging is many students who are interested, and one of them is right here working on a PhD on Muslim-Christian dialogue, focusing on questions related to the environment. Religion in general, I think, has played a rather ambivalent role in its understanding or its relation to the environment. Religions in general have often been accused of being either passive or actively involved in the use and abuse of the environment. And particularly, I think, monotheistic religions, the Semitic traditions, which have a more or less dualistic relationship to nature, and then if we look at the Bible, and Genesis has often been accused of being responsible in the idea of humans having dominion over the earth. That term dominion is one that has been really looked at and discussed in relation to environmental issues and crises. And I think rightfully so, although there's also been plenty of critique of that idea. Secondly, I think religions in general have a more or less dualistic understanding of the world, and the idea of salvation as being something outside or beyond the world. And that's also something that hasn't really encouraged care for the environment and for the world, or at least that's hypothetically at least the case. On the other hand, religions indeed do have plenty of resources also to draw from in terms of care for the environment and commitment to the protection of the environment. And of course, religions do affect people's behavior maybe more than any other area of human life and activity. And so religions, I think, of late have taken more and more responsibility. And of course, we all know what Pope Francis has done in his encyclical Laudato Si, where he has very explicitly related the environmental concern to ethics. I think, whereas in the past, environmental concerns have arisen mostly out of science or out of economic issues. What Pope Francis has done has been related explicitly to moral concern and the concern for the vulnerable and the poor of this earth. And of course, being a Jesuit university, this is something that we have indeed a great responsibility to take up. So the second question was how can my discipline engage in this issue? And I'm thinking in particular about my discipline being comparative theology or interreligious dialogue. So religions on their own usually don't have the critical ability to look at themselves and see where they often go wrong, or what the resources might be that they have in order to address some of the issues of the world today. And so what comparative theology or interreligious dialogue can do, I think, is allow religions to exert some kind of critical reflection upon each other. So religions can call each other out on ways in which their beliefs and their attitudes may be harmful to the environment. So I think that critical element is important in addressing these issues. But religions and interreligious dialogue can also be a way in which religions can inspire one another. Some religions are indeed more environmentally friendly than other religions. I'm thinking in particular of Jainism, a religion that most people don't think about in this context, but it's a religion that is incredibly concerned with nature in the broadest sense of the term. So some religions are more environmentally friendly than others, and interreligious dialogue is precisely a way in which religions can learn from one another and can be inspired by one another, both in their understanding of the world and in their practice. If we think of Buddhism, for example, it's a religion that places a lot of emphasis on the interconnection between humans, but also between humans and nature and life in general. And so, again, offering resources for the possibility of growth and a deeper understanding of our relationship to nature. So in April, this is just a small commercial, I have invited Mary Evelyn Tucker, who's one of the leading voices in interreligious dialogue and the environment and climate change, to come and speak to us on the challenge of interreligious dialogue in the age of Laudato Si. So on April 7th, she will be giving a lecture, and we will have a Muslim and a Buddhist respond to that lecture. So I hope this will create a stimulating conversation. And then finally, how to engage this issue in the classroom. As Tom has already pointed out, I think as a Jesuit university, every discipline has a responsibility to address this issue from within their field. And in theology, I think now with Laudato Si, we have been given an immense gift, a tremendous resource for theology classes in general to draw from. And we in the Department of Theology have committed ourselves to teaching this document in all of our theology core classes. So I think that's a very important way in which we can engage that issue from within theology at BC. And in addition to our core classes, in the theology department, there are colleagues who teach courses on ethics and the environment, or the Bible and the environment, or systematic theology and the environment. So it can be addressed from within any particular discipline of theology. But I think, and what is particularly important, is that every student is confronted or exposed to these challenges and to these questions and to ways in which religion, and in particular the Catholic tradition, can address these issues and challenge us to a new and different attitude towards life and nature. Thank you.
So we've invited Jeremy, who is playing the role of resident expert today, to kind of reflect on what he's heard and tie it more broadly to a set of public issues that are part of the conversation, and frankly, whatever hits his fancy, because he knows what he's talking about. So we're going to turn it over to him for a few minutes to do that.
Pressure. Okay, thanks for having me. So I guess the first thing I should forewarn you is that climate scientists are notoriously known for bringing a whole room down and depressing everybody. So hopefully I don't do that for you. I've only got 5 minutes, so there's only so much I can bring you down. I'm a paleoclimatologist, so I think about the future, but I mostly study the past. Ice ages, why did they come and go? But also thinking a lot about what was the world like in the past when it was a degree warmer or 3 degrees warmer, and what insight does that give us? And I guess I just want to reiterate, actually just sitting here listening to all this, I always kind of wish that I had entered climate science 30 years ago, because I think a lot of very cool, interesting, fundamental work was sort of done for the last generation. And my generation is going to have a ball with lots of interesting questions and details to work out, but the big interesting stuff I think in the science has really been laid out. And I do think that scientists have kind of been perplexed with, like, we figured it out, why hasn't the world fixed all of this? And I think it's really because, right, this does need to be a much bigger discussion. And I think that's where a lot of the interesting conversation is to come still. So let's see, a handful of different thoughts that I sort of scribbled down here for 4 minutes. And I guess, I'll just give you my thoughts on COP21 and the meeting this week. And the biggest thing I would just emphasize is that this is COP21, which means we've been doing this for a long time, since before I could even grow stubble like I can now. So, and not much has happened with climate policy at all up to this point. So my biggest hope, and I think for most climate scientists, we sort of, I think, have grown into being a fairly kind of pessimistic, cynical bunch and nothing's happened, but I think the biggest hope here is that something just gets going this year. Not that COP solves everything, but that things get moving. And if it does, I think we'll look back at 2015 as a bit of a change in direction for where things are going. I think the most important thing that comes out of the science, I think what has almost all climate scientists a bit concerned, and me included, is the momentum behind climate change. So this is not like a lot of other problems I think that we're used to dealing with, where you have an issue, you work on it, you figure it out, and the problem goes away. Climate, I always sort of describe it to my students as it's like this huge freighter, super tanker on the ocean, and once that thing is moving, I mean, like, it's going. You can't just hit the brakes and just stop it or back it up to where you want to go. There's just a huge amount of inertia there. So for instance, the carbon that we emit today is going to be in the atmosphere, a lot of it, for centuries to thousands of years, which means temperatures are going to keep rising for a good time to come, and ice sheets are melting, and they're going to be melting, which means sea levels are going to be rising for centuries to really thousands of years to come. And the other critical piece of inertia is that even once we get very serious about switching to renewable energies, if we do, is that whole global energy transformation is going to take decades to happen. And so what I always try to emphasize to people is it doesn't look that different out there right now, but it's already changed much more than you realize. It's baked into the system. And one sign of that actually is, so 2015 is going to be hands down for sure the warmest year on record. And if you watch the news in January, I'm sure that you'll see plenty of that. And we've actually just this year hit the 1 degree Celsius kind of line here for global warming since 100 years ago. And it's interesting because in Paris, what policymakers are talking about is basically trying to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius. And that's like the grand heroic hope that will take just massive aggressive efforts just to keep it to 2, which again gives you a sense for that momentum, because our greatest hope here is we can keep climate change from only doubling beyond what it's already done so far, right? There's a lot of inertia behind this. So the other key thing, I guess, that comes out of the science that's really been pretty well pinned down is it's not that hard to actually predict where the future goes. It really comes down to, if you want to boil it down to its root, it's how much total carbon do we emit. So the total peak amount of warming we get and all the impacts that scale along with that, it basically scales with the total slug of carbon that we emit to the atmosphere, which basically tells you more if you want to minimize damages and change, you just need to keep that total slug of CO2 down. And in terms of thinking about the policy, I'm not a policy maker at all, but I try to follow it. And the bits that I've gleaned from people who know a lot more than I do, I guess, is that means what you need to think about then is the longer term changes of energy and what needs to happen to ultimately really remove us completely off of fossil fuels so we're not emitting carbon. So in Paris, probably what will be happening, what usually happens with these meetings, is there's a lot of short-term targets set. So I think Obama has pledged that the US will drop emissions 28% by 2025, and China will peak their emissions in 2030 and then start to tail off. But a lot of discussion is always about what will we do in the next 10 years, the next 15 years, 20 years, which is important and good. But I guess I'm hoping that people are also thinking about the longer term changes that need to happen, because it's not necessarily that difficult to shave off that first 10%, 20% of emissions. You can do a lot of the stuff that we've already been doing in the US, and our emissions have been dropping. Like we can increase energy efficiency, we can switch from coal to natural gas, and do a lot of these things to start the trajectory of emissions down. But in the meantime, if we haven't thought about the deeper, kind of more radical, transformative, innovative kind of energy solutions you're going to need to have happen, then we're going to get to 2030, 2040, have taken all that low-hanging fruit, but we're still going to be then on all natural gas, and we're still going to be heating our homes with fossil fuels. And if you want to get beyond that, then it really comes down to some innovative, brilliant kind of technologies for improving batteries and all the rest. And so a lot of energy experts always seem to flag the fact that we've kind of tossed just peanuts, just chump change at energy innovation, and not really invested a whole lot. And that's not just true of the US, it's true of most developed countries around the world. It's just sort of kind of a snooze fest on R&D for energy. And I think the numbers I hear is we need to 2, 3, 4 times more investment needs to go to physicists here or at MIT to think about how to boost up these energy technologies. So I guess I'll leave it at that. Hopefully I didn't depress you too much.
Just the right amount of depression. So I want to thank everybody. In a minute, I'll hand the mic to you and ask you to turn it on, or I'm going to create that screeching sound with two microphones right close to each other. So if you don't mind me handing it to you for now. I felt like a kid in a candy shop listening to that, because it's so fantastic to hear people who are really very, very smart in their fields think deeply about a problem that no one person has the solution to. And so I wrote down some themes and, you know, started to develop some questions, but I have to admit that the first thing I'd be interested in asking is, did any of you hear something from one of your colleagues that you'd like to reflect on or respond to or ask more about? Because that was a lot of great information from a number of disciplines. So let me first begin by inviting you, if you'd like, to react to or respond to each other. And then depending on where that goes, I may or may not insert additional questions. So is there anybody that wants to specifically react or respond to Joe? So just, yeah, we're good.
So much of what was said by my colleagues here was the bad things that happen with global warming, from disease to rising waters to so on. And these are the costs that are actually the benefits of doing something about it. By having temperatures rise less quickly, we reduce these costs, and that's the good news. But of course, on the other side of the ledger is the fact that doing these things are expensive. It slows down GNP growth, it makes energy more expensive, and so on. And that's really the trade-off we have to think about. So I guess what I would ask my colleagues, that to the extent that we know what we would like to do, how we would like the future to be different from the way it's going to be if we do nothing, what is it that we do to bring these changes about? I mean, we've heard about more research in science and so on, but this is a massive ocean liner, as we pointed out. So what is it that we can do to start to turn this around? And again, the answer from an economist, the first answer is always a pretty simple one. Make bad things more expensive, so people will stay away from, not stay away, but use less. But I'd like to ask other people, what are we going to do about it?
I can take that. I think this makes it easy because I come from a practicing profession. And one of the things that we know is historically hospitals have been rewarded with the more stuff they use, because hospital bills are based on charges, not costs. With the advent of the Affordable Care Act, and particularly with the provisions that went into effect in 2014 and the development of accountable care organizations, for the first time, hospitals are being held accountable for improving the quality of care, but at the same time reducing costs. So that really fits very nicely into your economic argument. And there is really only one system and some pockets across the country who have significantly reduced the amount of waste and whatnot they're generating. That's the Kaiser system in California, and then there's some other pockets across the country. But if you go into any hospital, it doesn't take you more than 3 minutes to just see huge amounts of waste that are being generated. But this will be the first time that we're beginning to turn that around.
Who else, please?
I have maybe a question related to it, and something that hasn't yet come up, I think, is the question of the developing world and the responsibility of the developed world towards economic development in those parts of the world. I read today about the meeting between Obama and Modi really challenging Obama.
Modi being in India.
Yeah, the Prime Minister of India, challenging Obama to help out more, of course, with the developing countries. And that, of course, would take a lot of commitment and I think a real lifestyle change also on our part. So I think in the end, sort of what I see ahead is just a radical change in lifestyle and commitment to simplicity and to more local solutions and living. And I'm wondering whether this is also an area in which climate scientists are looking. So you said that we're only tossing peanuts, but what would be sort of the big fruit that we would need to bite in order to make some changes, some radical changes.
Yeah, so I guess so I completely agree with you. I mean, a carbon tax always comes up as the simple, obvious economist answer. So I would say that sounds like the wise thing to do to me. It also just sounds politically impossible at this point. It just seems very far off. If you look at the polling, it just is like, every state you look at, people just don't want a carbon tax. So politically, it just doesn't seem that feasible. But the interesting thing, actually, if you do look at the polling, is as divided and as much as people like to fight and argue about climate change, and I just came home from Thanksgiving, and there's plenty of fights about climate change, because I'm a climate scientist, it's amazing how much more agreement there is on other policies. So if you ask regulation, then a fair number more Americans are on board. And then if you ask R&D, then people are much more on board, kind of across the country, because whether you're liberal and you like solar, or you're libertarian and you like distributed energy and a solar panel member who did my own thing, people seem to be fairly on board with R&D. So I guess I would just point back to that as maybe the most politically tractable and ultimately fruitful way to go, is just putting some more tax dollars towards R&D.
Anybody else want to add to that before I ask a question? Joe?
Well, just to increase the depression level, I mean, one of the things that's both fortunate and unfortunate is that carbon-based fuels are getting cheaper by the minute. I mean, look at people are paying $1.50 for gas in some places, $2 for gas and so on. So because that stuff is so inexpensive, individuals do what's best for them, even when it's not best for the environment. Car sales are up, big car sales are up. So prices are just really important. I don't disagree with you that it's hard to do. But at the same time, look what happened to cigarettes. One of the reasons that the cigarette smoking is a quarter of what it used to be, and you'd like it to be less, is because cigarette packs cost $10. And people don't get started when the things are that expensive. Bad things were made really expensive, and it had really terrific results. So I don't disagree with you, but it's such a simple and straightforward, not solution, but step one, that it's just a chronic shame that we don't consider.
So to kind of, I've got this one, so I'm gonna, to kind of build on that, there's a climate blogger out of the New York Times. He was here for our common home in September, a guy named Andy Repkin, who in one of his pieces talked about the need for a new cultural narrative on climate change. And it's an idea I've been thinking a lot about, and from the perspective of social work, what's the broader new cultural narrative on social justice? But in keeping with that, what I'd ask sort of, if you think of the cultural narrative as the narrative of your discipline and your tradition, what has to change in the narrative for us to make progress on these questions? So what has to change about our consumption habits, our attitudes towards tax policy, for example, in economics? But in each of your disciplines or in your traditions, to use a touchy-feelier term, what has to change in the narrative to contribute, Catherine, you talked about lifestyle, right? To contribute to the kinds of changes that we're looking for. And I would welcome, Judy, you addressed this a little bit in the sort of the incentivization, that's not a real word, the incentives in healthcare to use a lot of stuff versus not use a lot of stuff. I'd be interested in other reactions, more from you, Judy, or other reactions from other disciplines on that question.
All right, thinking off the top of my head here. I'm going back to the Affordable Care Act, and one of the places where I think it failed miserably, and it failed because it was political, was the personal mandate in many ways was taken out. Now, we know, and I'm talking about people who engage in poor lifestyle choices leading to obesity, which in turn leads to diabetes, cardiac, and so forth and so on down the line. They use a way disproportionate amount of healthcare resources. And that failed at the federal level. We are seeing business pick up a lot of those initiatives. We see it on this campus among faculty. There's a lot of workplace health incentives, which I personally applaud. In some places, they've gone from the carrot to the stick. And I have a colleague who works for Maine Medical Center, and if they don't adhere, they have a surtax that they're charged on their health insurance, their professional health insurance. I think that's the way of the future. But I do think whether it becomes surtaxes on health insurance that's provided by your company, whether it's on the types of health care we will and won't pay for, or the amount, how we maybe make adjustments in the American for Disabilities Act so it doesn't reward obesity. A number of those things would be the kinds of things that could begin to affect people on the individual level. Another one that I just really rabid about is folks that get their immunization information from Jenny McCarthy and other equally well-founded web pages. You know, and we know that's a huge, immunizations are the most fiscally responsible way of improving health in the world. And yet in this country, we have school districts where 25% below herd immunity of kids aren't immunized. So I could go on, but I'll stop there. But I need you.
Yeah, we do want to get you started, Tom. Start.
But we want to bring it down to the individual level.
Take the
On a
microphone
family
and
level.
start.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Mary.
Well, I mean, I think a difficult thing, whether you're talking about immunization or climate change, is that people, it's difficult for people to see. So you can say there are going to be floods in 30 years or 40 years, but people don't see that, so they don't believe in it. And that's, you know, the shift that happened. We went from a kind of science based on what everybody could see and feel to now science that experts can see, but ordinary people can't. So we're people who believe scientists, but many people don't. And I think in terms of narrative, a question is, are there ways to create narratives, popular narratives, that would help people understand, see, and feel what the consequences of these things are going to be? And I don't know who can do that. But I think that's crucially important, because we're not the problem in terms of, you know, people who don't believe this. So how do you get those people? And maybe, you know, Catherine is right that religion could play a greater role.
Well, what strikes me though is that the narrative already has changed fundamentally. I mean, I'm very encouraged by what I hear, not only in the news but around me, in terms of people really now being committed to this cause and convinced that something has to happen and something has to change. So I think the narrative has already changed fundamentally, you know, even in comparison with Rio or Kyoto, where there were still a lot of deniers. I don't think that there are as many of them today, and I think among the young people there's certainly a real upswell also in concern about this issue. So I think in some ways it has changed, and partly because of what Mary said, we are starting to feel it and see the effects also of climate change. But yes, I do think, you know, at least in countries where religion, or contexts where religion does play a big role, that really is a very important message, that religious leaders are responsible for you know, transmitting and playing a big role in.
Anybody want to add to that before I ask another question? And then audience, start thinking about yours. We'll move to you in probably about 5 minutes.
I have a question I want to
Great.
pose to you from the religion. We've talked a lot about population health. We haven't talked very much about population growth or population control. And I would like your views on that, particularly from the position of a Jesuit and my colleagues, because you know, it's kind of, for me, like the elephant in the middle of the room. When you look at over the 20th century, our population increased about 4.5-fold. And every one of those individuals is using carbon in different amounts and different levels. But you know, what is our responsibility on that level?
Joe? I just want to add, before, I really want to open it to the audience, because you've been very, but many folks would argue in many countries, the problem is not too many people, it's too few people. Look at the population growth rates in places like Japan, Italy, Russia, where the population is declining. Look at the age distribution in those countries. There are way too few workers to produce the stuff to take care of all the old folks like me. So many people are saying the problem is not too many people, it's too few people.
So while we take a mic out into the audience, let's invite one other comment from somebody here on the panel about what we've just been discussing, and we'll get ready to take the mic to the audience. Thanks. And if there isn't one, Tom?
I thought she.
Oh,
Laura
I was
No,
gonna
Laura's
carry the
gonna
mic
pass the
around.
mic. Anyone?
Let's hear from.
All right. We are ready, audience, if you are. And what we'll do is we'll send the mics out into the audience and we'll share the lavalier now up and down to do our responses.
Hi, I'm Michael. I'm in the philosophy department. In terms of changing the narrative or even the language of symbols, what do you all think about institutional divestment from fossil fuels?
You know, we didn't think that question was coming. We were not prepared. Would anybody like to take that on? Would anybody not like to take that?
I will say, I think it has almost no impact. It's fun. You divest your stocks, someone else buys them. It has no impact on the companies whatsoever. Symbolically, I think it's a good idea, but I think the total impact of it is close to zero. It feels good, it does little.
Next question.
Actually, can I just chime in? I guess I would just say,
Yeah.
I basically totally agree with you. But I don't know for sure if it does a little in the long run, right? I mean, if somehow you really got things moving and you got, I don't know, 45% of the schools across the country divesting, then symbolic, I mean, that starts to take on some meaning. So in the short run, I agree, and it's never gonna actually affect the bottom line of Exxon. But does that start to go and reshape culture a bit? Maybe. So, but yeah, I pretty much agree.
So I'm in the theology department, and I kind of want to synthesize what's been said with respect to Catholic mission and Jesuit identity. Professor Childs touched upon it, Professor Cornell. And I guess I'm really wondering, what's been the response, if any, in your discipline to the Pope's faith-based message about climate change? I think as somebody in theology, that's something that we've been so excited about, that he's changing the narrative. And I'm curious about how that's been received in other disciplines, by your students, by your faculty members, if it's been ignored, pushed, received, what's been the response?
Well, I mean, I'll say in the English department here, it's made faculty feel that they can contribute to the extent that they work on environmental issues and teach those issues. They're contributing to the mission in a way that they didn't before. So I think it's had the effect of making people feel more kind of part of a community and that they're contributing.
Actually, I got maybe 3 quick questions, hopefully.
Why don't you ask all 3,
All
and
right.
then we'll feel.
Yeah, okay. Jeremy probably knows the first 2 things. Well, is there any consensus on what the temperature rise needs to be in order to release the methane reserves in the Arctic, which would be pretty catastrophic after that, I understand. The second thing is, as you point out, due to the carbon cycle, the carbon in the, we've already released, and it's going to continue to release until at least who knows when. And that's not coming out anytime soon, centuries, maybe 1,000 years, just the way it works. Is, from what I've seen, hopefully you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, it looks like it's already baked in. That 2 degrees centigrade is going to happen anyways. That's kind of done deal. So maybe answer those 2 things. And the third thing is sort of goes back to the idea of nukes. And I think, you know, traditional pressurized hot water reactors really have a lot of problems, but liquid salt, thorium-based things look like they could really be significant and useful if you could get the PR for them right. So there you go.
Yeah, I guess just to speak quickly, those first 2 questions. So one on how much more does it take for the Arctic methane to, No, I don't think there's a simple answer to that. And there's probably not, like there's just some temperature at which there it goes and before then you're fine. Right, it's gonna be some kind of gradient of change. But that one's not very clear. That's like a lot of other sort of tipping points in the climate. And the bottom line with those is always more carbon, more risk. But you know exactly where is tough to say. And then the second one was about, we're talking about the carbon cycle.
Is
2 degrees inevitable?
Yeah.
We're at 1 this year. We've done 1. We've got enough carbon in the atmosphere. Another half is kind of guaranteed, and we're going to be on fossil fuels long enough that to avoid. It seems really hard to imagine we're not going to hit 2, but at least for now, that's the talking point of politicians. But I mean, at some point they're going to break ranks, and I think start to concede that's going to be pretty tough to pull off.
And the nuclear energy question, if no one else wants to fill it, Joe's willing to volunteer.
Well, yet another topic in which I am far from an expert. My ignorance knows almost no bounds. But it seems to me that the way we have done nuclear energy in this country is in some sense the worst possible way. Every single reactor is a brand new plant. They take dozens of years to get in, if they ever do get in. And it would seem to me in an ideal world, with technology better than it ever was, you could have a nuclear reactor plant with the kind of recycling the French do. I think they produce 0.3% of the hazardous waste that we worry about. It's obviously more expensive to do it that way. And get a plan that works, get a blueprint that works, and do lots of them instead of every single one being a whole new show. But again, I'm not an expert on this, but it is clean in lots of ways. Most of the concerns about nuclear energy has to do with waste, and it turns out that the recycling, much more expensive way to do it, takes care of that. The problem with so much of this thing, so many of these things is what looks like the price is not the price. Carbon fuels look cheap, $2 a gallon, but they're not cheap because all that carbon is creating damage elsewhere that should be part of that price. People on the Cape who generally don't have water bills because they all have wells that go into aquifers behave as though water is free. And it is free to them because they don't pay a water bill. And yet there are obviously costs of draining that aquifer. So again, most things in the world, believe me, is something mispriced.
Do we have another question out in the audience? Here, David. Why don't you go ahead since you're already, because we outraced Laura, so we'll do this one and then here.
This question is for any of the panelists. What do you think that BEC can do to lower its carbon footprint?
All right, stop smoking, smoke-free campus. These are very simple things. I think in the dining hall, if you look at the amount of food it's wasted because the portion size is so huge, is beginning having half-size portion controls. There's a few other things, but they're the two that immediately come to mind. Very simple things.
Anyone else want to add to that?
Actually, I can add to that.
Great, Laura. Laura's a member of the working group.
I can add to that. I know that there's a lot actually that's been done on campus and for like the past 10 years. You can actually go to most divisions' websites and they have information on what they've been trying to do. So there's actually a huge amount that dining has been trying to do and working on, and vendors have no idle policies and stuff like that. So that's all really facilities side stuff, and a lot has been happening. Not that more can't happen, but or should happen, but just so you, there's a lot of information out there. But I would actually, since I have the mic in my hand now, the cultural narrative, right? Our cultural narrative is consume and throw it away, right? Consume and throw it away. And we just got through Black Friday. And we're in Cyber Monday. I mean, that's our cultural narrative, right? And one of the key problems is that we have become separate. We see ourselves as separate from Earth, right? We are of all of this is all Earth, all around us. We are where we're sitting and talking to one another, and that is something that has happened to us. We've become so separated because of technology and Francis Bacon, God love him, and et cetera, right? So that, I think, is one of the things we need to start reconnecting for students, and we need to do it in each of our disciplines, you know, in biology classes, in theology classes, in English classes, somehow helping students recognize their intimate connection with one another, increase compassion,
And that
et
was,
cetera.
that is an area that, again, the encyclical that Laudato Si
Yes.
talks about, not only from a solidarity standpoint, but from the interdependence between, interdependence isn't even the right word because that suggests separate entities between humans.
Interconnection.
Right, but the
Our
interconnection
interconnection.
of the species and the planet is something that that document offered a particular framework around. Joe, while we're passing the microphone to David, we'll come to
But
you.
under the best of scenarios, your most optimistic scenario, how long does it take for that to happen? We're gonna be underwater by then. By the time America's culture of consumption, all sorts of things that I would love to see change, but these are century-long changes, aren't they?
Well, that is interesting too, and something to think about for the panel. How do you balance the long play and the short play, right? You don't have to answer that yet because we've got, David's waiting, but let's hold that in reserve as another potential conversation.
I want, oh, this is working, is it?
Turn it on. No, don't, use it as an electricity.
Well,
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
yeah, two brief comments that parallel the question on divestiture and a number of things that Joe has said. There seems to me there are two things that are either free or nearly free. One is efficiency, especially energy efficiency by the largest consumers, by the energy producing industry. The payback period for most investments in efficiency is, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years. So it does take some capital up front for some efficiency improvements, but that's a sort of no-brainer, that doesn't cost that much money, and the payback period is very short. And if I insulate my house and it doesn't have any insulation in it, again, the payback period is very quick. The other thing is prices, energy prices. There have been a number of studies by the OECD and American economists around the world on subsidies to fossil fuel. And so maybe the biggest single thing we could do, we can't do it here at BC, but to take away the subsidies, the tax credits, the tax expenditures, all the taxes that are not paid, they're actually a cost by the fossil fuel industry. Of course, the political problem with doing that is severe. But a lot of other countries are doing it and have done it. There are dozens that have either removed all the subsidies for coal or reduced them. And again, if you look at what Americans are paying for fuel, we're not as bad as Saudi Arabia and Venezuela that are giving the stuff away and depleting their own natural resource base and polluting the air. But we're on the very low end, below average of what consumers pay around the world for fuel, for heat, and so forth. So we're subsidizing ourselves in a way out of business over time.
And look at what cars look like in Europe, they're much smaller.
Let's go here.
Ask a question
There
whether,
you go. Yeah, right there. You can't have to grab the mic.
just a question about whether this kind of stuff is being taught in the economics department. Do you have courses that address these kinds of issues?
Well, every economics course, microeconomics course, will feature the issue of what we call externalities, is how my behavior affects other people's well-being. And the fact is, in most prices, the externalities are not included. It's not included in the $2 I pay for gas, the damage. And so that's just an inefficiency that, in a better world, the prices will reflect the damage that's done by whatever you do. And as you point out, I hadn't even thought of this, not only are our prices lower than they should be because the externalities are not on it, but in fact, they're also lower than they should be because they may be subsidized by federal programs.
All right, last question here, and then we're gonna wrap up.
That's a perfect little segue into something that I wanted to come back to. Tom Childs mentioned climate is centrally about environmental justice. I'm a grad student in sociology, and I think that that's one of the core messages of our discipline on climate change as well, that this is fundamentally about justice. So I thought I'd just take an opportunity to point out that I think a lot of the conversation here has been a pretty middle class kind of conversation. We consume too much. Well, who consumes too much? And I thought, and other things, but I thought I would lift up the voice of some of the climate justice groups in Paris right now at the conference of the parties, and just they have 5 core messages, and I thought I would just read that, and then maybe we could get some reaction. So this is the It Takes Roots campaign. The first blank, they want to lift up stories and leadership of grassroots, frontline, fence line communities of color, and special attention to indigenous peoples. Second, call out the US and other, quote, climate criminals at Paris COP. Third, gender justice, how climate change is impacting women, not with victim frame, but lifting up their solutions. Fourth, a just transition. This is about a just transition for the communities most affected. So when we turn off a coal-fired power plant, what happens to those workers? That's a real issue for those workers. Fifth, keep the oil in the ground. Those are the 5 core messages, and I think that that's a pretty different conversation than some of what I heard tonight, which was interesting, I should say. I don't mean to criticize. Thank you for sharing your perspectives.
So bringing it to close with the concept of economic justice and environmental justice, and asking if there's anybody that wants to react on those 5 points or build on them as we begin to close the conversation.
Well,
About the audience. Into the audience.
Anybody in the audience? Thank you for that invitation, Tom. Anybody else in the audience want to respond or build on those? Please, Sam.
The only thing that I would add, I'm in the School of Social Work, and I would echo your points that I think often our discussions of climate change come from a very privileged standpoint. It takes privilege to sit here and sort of discuss this in terms of consumerism, when we could be discussing it in terms of poverty and the communities most affected. So just to echo that, and I would like to hear more about, I guess, that intersection between environmental justice and social justice, which is a core part of our mission here at BC, and maybe a place in which we could contribute.
What are your thoughts on that? The intersection of environmental justice and social justice.
Just to bring up again what I raised in terms of Pope Francis's message was precisely focusing on that, on social justice and environmental justice. And I agree with you that we have to look at it indeed from the perspective of those who are the victims and the most vulnerable. But it is the people who are the middle class and that have to change their lifestyle in order for justice to emerge in these kinds of questions. So I do think that it has to be, this conversation has to be conducted in these kinds of avenues, and we're the ones who have to change our lifestyles, I think. So we can take some inspiration from and some appeal, some prophetic appeal from what is being done to the vulnerable, but we are the ones who have to change, and so I think it's important that we have this conversation.
so just a comment and a question on that. I think you raise a good point that the kind of sacrifices that the American middle and upper class would have to make to consume less stuff is small change compared to the costs on really poor countries who have GNPs of $3 a head, and asking them to cut back in any way. That's one of the reasons why they get irate at us. Say, you've been consuming, America consumes 25% of the world's energy or something like that, with some much smaller percentage of the population. Why are you telling us what we should do when you used to be like us 300 years ago and you've gone way past? All very, very understandable. And the other thing, of course, that's a huge problem in all of this is it takes communal action. If a particular country cut their energy use to zero, a small country, that would have almost no impact on the world scene. So folks have to get together, which is why meetings like the ones in Paris at least give us hope. But the last thing I end with is a question. Your last thing was leave carbon-based stuff in the ground. And I'm wondering if there's a timetable on that. That's a goal for when? Not next year, I hope.
Not on the little plank that I just read. I don't know. I would have to find out more. What I read was oil. So I think.
Yeah, oil's heating a lot of houses, driving a lot of cars. And again, as a long-term goal, this is admirable, but aren't we wedded for a while at least to carbon-based fuels? That's 98% of what we use.
Judy, are you holding the mic because you'd like
Well,
to? And then we'll come down to Jeremy,
I
you
wanted
do
to
last
go
word.
back just a little bit. I don't disagree that this has been a middle and upper middle class discussion, and there's much that we need to do to change our behavior. But even if we change our behavior, that doesn't address the needs of the poor. And I think a very important responsibility we have is, regardless of our discipline, that we think, what can we bring to uplifting the poor, the disabled, and other at-risk populations. It's not asking them to sacrifice, but to be able to bring our knowledge and whatnot to make their lives better at the same time that it will have maybe a small but some impact on climate change. I don't think this has to be a zero-sum game. I think if we're creative, we can bring some win-win solutions to the table.
Jeremy, last word for you. As you put water in your mouth, sorry about that.
I guess, Bobby, I'm wondering what you're thinking, or what you're getting at with thinking about the poor. Do you mean in terms of like how to, I guess, help developing nations cope with the impacts of climate change? Is that how you mean, or do you mean in terms of suggesting that?
Actually, I'm not gonna let Bobby answer, only because we're at 6 o'clock and this is your chance to wrap
close.
this up
Okay.
if you'd like to.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the other thing, it always seems to me fundamentally, I don't view it so much as in terms of my personal view is not so much how do we do with less. I mean, I think that's important and that's relevant, but I also think that's been hugely divisive for America for a long time. I always see this fundamentally as a technological problem. And so, again, I always sort of come back to thinking about how you improve energy technologies, because that has to sort of be the final end game here.
It's not just a technological problem, it's a cultural problem, right? I mean, you're right to some degree, but we have to change people's thinking, right? We have to realize that what we do, whether we're a disposable society or whether we're driving a 8-cylinder SUV, that it's going to impact not only the planet but other people's lives, and it's going to disproportionately impact those that can't really defend themselves or take care of themselves or don't have the means to protect themselves. And I think we really need to think of, to change how we think about what we're doing on this planet. Otherwise, it's going to be, a snail's pace. I mean, if you just look at what we're doing, America as well as China, not to get on this topic, but we're exporting all of our waste and pollution now to low and poor resource countries around the world. This is what America is doing, and it is now causing just catastrophic disease and impacting those countries, and it's going to impact those countries for decades, and yet we don't seem to have a conscience about that, to care about that. And so I think, we need to start with changing the way we think and view other people, that we are accountable for those around us. And until we do that, I think we're going to move at a snail's pace. So
Can I just clarify?
Yeah.
So I agree with you, and as it relates to broader environmental issues, I completely agree. But it does seem to me scientifically right. If we were somehow at a zero carbon world, then a lot of what you're saying would still be very true in terms of a host of other environmental issues, but at least the climate component to me seems like it would be largely off the table.
Jim, would you like to close us? You were leaning forward.
No, I'm listening.
So this is always the moment when I wish I were Tom Ashbrook, because there'd be cool music in the background and I'd use some beat poet rhythm to summarize all the brilliant moments that have just happened. I don't have his game. So instead, I'm simply going to say I learned a lot. I hope that you learned a lot, and I'm very grateful to six of you for coming together and giving us this opportunity to share and reflect. It was out of your comfort zone and you were gracious to do it. So please join me in thanking you.